you have anything else, Jenny?
I just wanted to know if there's been any contact through the mediators with Hamas since they submitted their proposal the other night. When do you expect there to be any contact? There's some reporting that the Israelis aren't going to participate in further negotiations.
I will let the mediator speak to that. Obviously, we were in contact on Thursday. On Tuesday night with Egyptian mediators, and the secretary spoke directly with the Qatari mediator, the prime minister, yesterday in his meeting in Doha. They, as I think you know, tend to be in fairly regular contact with the political wing of Hamas. In terms of what the next step of negotiations will look like, I don't want to get into that from here, other than to say that we are committed to trying to push forward to get ceasefire. We were disappointed with the response that came back from Hamas yesterday. As the secretary said, as you've heard some other people say, there were some suggested changes that were fairly minor and were fairly workable, and then there were some that we don't see as workable. But that said, we are committed to trying to push forward and get a ceasefire because we continue to believe it is in the interests of all involved parties.
You were disappointed, but were you surprised that they came back with these changes? Given that Netanyahu didn't ever publicly commit to this, I know the U.S. says that Israel has been on board, but
I personally doubt that comments or lack of comments from the Israeli government had anything to do with the substance of the Hamas response. I think the substance of I'm not going to characterize why they might have submitted the response that they did. We were disappointed both that it took so long to get a response and that the response had a number of changes that could drag the negotiations out further. As you heard the secretary say yesterday, getting a ceasefire is urgent. There are people that are suffering every day. There are Palestinians who are dying every day as a result of this conflict. There are hostages that continue to be held. See the conflict in the north of Israel continue to reach concerning levels, and we want to tackle all of those issues, and the best way to do that is through a ceasefire, and that's why we'll continue to pursue it. We want it to happen without delay. Saeed.
Thank you. Matt, welcome back.
Thank
we
you.
Missed you. A couple of questions that follow up on Simon and Kamala. First of all, on the talks itself, you said that Hamas's response was late in coming, but the resolution at the Security Council was on Monday. The response was on Tuesday, almost like 24 hours.
I don't think the clock started with the UN Security Council resolution. It started with the proposal being delivered to them, which was 12 days before their response.
On the issue of the response, now, we're a bit confused because the National Security Advisor, Mr. Sullivan, said actually they were minor. In fact, all the suggestions by Hamas or the amendments were quite workable, quite doable. Now, we heard something different.
That is not what he said, but go ahead.
Okay.
He said a number of them were minor, some were problematic.
Well, that's my question, actually. But the secretary said that there are some workable and some are not workable. Can you share with us some of these things that are not workable, for instance?
No, I cannot. I'm not going to get into the details of that from here. I think it's appropriate to conduct a public negotiation. Okay. But as the secretary said, there are a number of things that Hamas suggested in this response that go further than they had agreed to in previous iterations. As you know, there have been proposals that go back and forth, and as the secretary said, usually in a negotiation, if a party agrees to something in one stage of the negotiation, they don't then make a more or a less reasonable demand later on in the process. All that said, we'll continue to push to try to get a resolution because we think it's in the interest of all the Palestinian people and the Israeli people.
As far as I know, there's been no official Israeli response, but you guys keep saying that Israel agreed to this, yet we have not heard from the prime minister, we have not heard from any senior official saying, yeah, accept or reject, whatever. There's been no response. So there are reports, Israeli media reports, that say that the prime minister did not even share the document with many of his ministers, and that's been Fear or Smotrich and so on. Do you have any comment on that? If the Israelis have not responded, why are they taking so long to respond to something that initially was their proposal?
Why are they taking a long time? The Israeli government does not need to respond to its own proposal. It's their proposal. But in terms of support, for this, to be clear, in terms of support for that proposal, two things. Number one, it's not true that the Israeli government hasn't come out and said it was their proposal and they supported. They did do that. They did that in the days immediately after. There were advisors to the prime minister that came out and said that publicly. Number two, the secretary discussed this directly with the prime minister himself on Tuesday when we were in Israel, and the prime minister reaffirmed his support for the proposal. It's
in an
simply
official
not true.
Statement, did he support it?
In a direct conversation with, in a direct conversation with the secretary relayed publicly. But Saeed, again, there are officials from the Israeli government who have come out and said that as well.
then clear it for us, because at least I'm confused on the issue of the first phase and the second phase and so on. It seems that the Israelis, in all their statements, they focus on the first phase, but not on the transitional second phase, and let's say, allowing all the stuff that is in the second phase and the third phase. Could you explain to us where, is this the sticking point, for instance, between the Palestinians and the Israelis?
I'm not going to get into what the various sticking points are in the proposal. When it comes to statements made by the Israeli government, I'm just going to look at what the Israeli government has done.
Right.
And that they put forward this proposal that the president outlined 13 days ago that would lead to an immediate ceasefire, that would lead to an extended ceasefire as negotiations moved from phase 1 to phase 2, and that ultimately could bring about an end to the war. And one of the points that the secretary was getting to yesterday, it's really important that in that proposal that the president outlined, that the ceasefire doesn't end in 6 weeks. There's a six-week ceasefire that continues when negotiations continue. Hamas could have agreed to that proposal, didn't lock them in long term. There's an agreement. There would be continued negotiations at the end of 6 weeks. Those negotiations actually start in 16 days, and the ceasefire continued. But at least we would have had a ceasefire. At least we would have had a halt to the suffering. And Hamas didn't do that. Instead, they dragged it out for 12 days, and now there will be continued haggling and a delay in the ceasefire, and that's what we were disappointed in. But as I said, we are committed to continue to work on this because it is so vitally important to the people in the region.
Just a couple of follow-up. There's been a UN report detailing Israeli war crimes during the first month of the war. Have you seen the report?
We saw that the report was released today, and we're reviewing it now.
So you don't have any comment on that?
Other than that, we are looking at it.
And lastly, on last Saturday's raid, now there's been more than 276 Palestinians were killed in Jabalia. And I know that the U.S. government, the Western government, congratulated Israel on freeing 4 hostages, but then we had 276 Palestinian civilians, mainly civilians, and 600 others wounded. How do you respond to this kind of enormous death toll?
The Secretary actually spoke to this the last couple of days while he was in the region, and I'll just echo what he said, which is our condolences go out to any innocent civilian that was killed or injured in this operation. We don't want to see any civilian die in this operation. That's one of the reasons why we're pushing for a ceasefire, is to stop the suffering that is happening every day in Gaza. If you look at the circumstances of this raid, there are a couple things that are clear. Number one, Israel has a right, as any country does, to try and rescue hostages that were taken. Hostages never should have been taken in the first place. They shouldn't have been held for more than 8 months. They should have been released a long time ago. They should be released today. But any country would have the right to try and rescue hostages that are being held by a terrorist organization. That's the first thing. The second thing that's clear is that in the course of executing that raid, there was an intense firefight between Israel and Hamas. And I think that's important to note, that it wasn't just Israeli soldiers firing as they executed that raid. It was Hamas firing at them, and of course there was a crossfire. What apparently, by all accounts, was a very intense firefight between Israel and Hamas. And as a result of that very intense firefight, it seems like more than 200 people died, and that is an immense human tragedy. But that is why we are working so hard to get a ceasefire, to stop that kind of human tragedy, both for Palestinian people and for the hostages that continue to be held, and for the families of hostages who continue to worry about the safety of their loved ones. And it's why we're going to continue to try and push and get that ceasefire as soon as possible.
Do you think that Israel adhered to the laws of war in this particular incident?
I cannot give you an assessment of that, but not having looked at all of the details and knowing all of the facts on the ground. As I said, they have a right to rescue hostages. We want to see them comply with the laws of war. In this case, there was a very intense firefight. They took fire from Hamas on their way after retrieving one of the sets of hostages, and that led to this really horrific human tragedy.
Thank you.